That night, Jerusalem was silent. A man had just been crucified on a cross. The people who hated him believed the story was finally over. His followers were terrified and scattered. Those who had believed he was the Messiah were left with one painful question. If Jesus really was the Son of God, why did he die? His body was taken down from the cross and placed inside a tomb. A large stone was rolled across the entrance. To human eyes, everything was over. But beyond what human eyes could see, something extraordinary was happening. According to traditional Christian belief, after his death, Jesus descended to the realm of the dead, often described as Hades, or the place of the departed. But why? Did Jesus go there because he had been defeated? No, he went there as a conqueror. For thousands of years, humanity had lived under the shadow of sin and death. Death seemed like a door that no human being could open from the other side. Kings died. The rich died. The poor died. The powerful died. No one could escape it. But then Jesus entered the very place humanity feared most. He entered death itself, not as a prisoner, but as the King. Imagine that moment. Darkness everywhere. No sunlight. No sound of the living. And then light appeared. Not the light of the sun, but the presence of the one who had just completed the work of redemption. Death believed it had swallowed Jesus, but death had made a terrible mistake. It did not understand whom it was holding, because the one standing before it was not merely a man. He was the Lord of life. Traditional Christian teaching connects Jesus' descent to the dead with his proclamation of victory and the breaking of death's power. This is reflected in the Apostles' Creed. He descended into hell. But the story does not end there. There is something even more incredible. If Jesus truly entered the realm of the dead, it means he went all the way into the deepest reality of human suffering. He knew what it meant to be rejected. He knew pain. He knew loneliness. And finally, he entered death. But he did not remain there. 3 days later, the stone in front of the tomb was rolled away. The tomb was empty. Jesus had risen. That is the heart of the story. If there had only been the cross, the story would have ended as a tragedy. But because there was the resurrection, the cross became a victory. Death was no longer the final destination. It became a doorway. This is why the story of Jesus descending to the dead carries such deep meaning for millions of Christians. He did not go there to prove that he was weak. He went there to prove that even death could not hold him. And when he walked out of the tomb, he carried a promise. A promise that death would not have the final word. A promise that those who place their faith in him can have hope beyond the grave. Perhaps the greatest fear in human life is not failure. It is not poverty. It is not loneliness. It is the thought that one day everything will simply end. But the resurrection declares something completely different. Death is not the end. And if Jesus entered the deepest darkness and walked out into the light, then no darkness is too deep for him. There are moments when our own lives can feel like a tomb. Hope seems gone. The door is closed. The stone seems impossible to move, and we think the story is finished. But the story of Jesus reminds us, when humanity thinks the story is over, God may only be beginning a new chapter. Jesus descended into the darkness. He faced death. He entered the place no human could conquer. And then he rose, not as a defeated man, but as the risen King, because the King entered the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome him. But there is another part of the story that many people overlook. If Jesus had already defeated death, why did he remain on earth for a while after his resurrection? Why didn't he immediately return to heaven? The answer may be more powerful than you think. The resurrection was not simply about proving that Jesus was alive. It was about showing his followers that everything he had promised was true. Early in the morning, women came to the tomb. They expected to find a dead body. Instead, they found an empty grave. The stone had been moved. The body was gone. And then they heard words that changed history. He is not here. He has risen. At first, the disciples struggled to believe it. They had watched Jesus die. They had seen the Roman soldiers. They knew exactly what death looked like. So when they heard that Jesus was alive, it sounded impossible. But then Jesus appeared to them. He spoke to them. He walked with them. He ate with them. He allowed them to see that he was not a ghost or an illusion. The same Jesus who had been crucified was standing in front of them, alive. The disciples who had once been terrified now had something they had never possessed before: hope. But Jesus still had one final mission for them. He told his followers to take his message to the world, not only to Jerusalem, not only to Israel, but to every nation. Think about how extraordinary that command was. A small group of ordinary people was being asked to carry a message that would eventually reach millions upon millions of people. They had no armies, no political power, no wealth, no technology, but they had witnessed something that could not easily be forgotten. They had seen the empty tomb. They had seen the risen Christ. And they believed that death had been defeated. Then came another extraordinary moment. Jesus led his disciples to a place near Bethany. He blessed them, and then he was taken up into heaven. Imagine what the disciples must have felt. Only days earlier, they believed everything was over. Now they had watched their teacher rise from the dead. And then they watched him disappear into the heavens. But Jesus did not leave them without a promise. He told them that they would not be alone. The Holy Spirit would come upon them. And that promise would transform frightened followers into bold witnesses. The story of Jesus, therefore, is not simply the story of a man who died and came back to life. It is the story of a victory that changed the meaning of death itself. The cross showed his sacrifice. The descent into the realm of the dead showed that he entered the deepest darkness. The resurrection showed that darkness could not hold him. And his ascension showed that his story did not end at the tomb. But perhaps there is one question that matters most. What does this mean for us today? Because it is easy to hear a story about something that happened 2,000 years ago and think it has nothing to do with our lives. But Christians believe the resurrection is not merely history. It is a promise. A promise that suffering does not have the final word. A promise that failure does not have the final word. A promise that the grave does not have the final word. You may be standing in your own season of darkness right now. Maybe something in your life feels completely broken. Maybe you have lost someone you love. Maybe a dream you worked for has collapsed. Maybe you feel as though there is a stone blocking the entrance to your future. And perhaps you are asking the same question the disciples once asked. Is this really the end? The story of Jesus gives a different answer. Sometimes the tomb looks like the end, until the stone begins to move. Sometimes silence feels like abandonment, until you realize that God has been working where you could not see. And sometimes the darkest night comes immediately before the dawn. Jesus did not promise that his followers would never experience darkness. He promised something greater. that darkness would never have the final victory. The one who entered death and came out alive is the reason Christians continue to believe that death is not the end of the story. The grave may be real, pain may be real, loss may be real, but so is hope. And that is why the story of Jesus continues to be told, not simply because a man died on a cross, but because the man on the cross walked out of the grave. The stone was moved, the tomb was empty, and the message that began in Jerusalem would eventually travel across the entire world. Jesus Christ is risen, and if he is risen, then perhaps your story is not over either. But there is one final mystery. If Jesus defeated death, why did he have to die in the first place? Why couldn't God simply forgive humanity without the cross? For Christians, the answer is found in the meaning of sacrifice. The cross was not an accident. It was not a plan that went wrong. Jesus willingly gave himself. He entered the suffering that humanity could not escape from and took upon himself the consequences of sin. That is why the cross stands at the center of Christianity. But the cross alone is not the whole story. The cross shows the sacrifice. The empty tomb shows the victory, and the resurrection changes everything. Imagine standing outside that tomb on the morning of the resurrection. The sun is beginning to rise. The ground is quiet. The stone has been moved. Inside, there is no body. Only the evidence that something impossible has happened. The disciples did not understand everything immediately, but slowly they began to realize what Jesus had told them all along. His death had not been the end. His descent into the realm of the dead had not been defeat. The grave had not won. God had won. And that message would change the world. The followers of Jesus began spreading the news. They traveled from city to city. They spoke to strangers. They faced rejection. They faced imprisonment. Some even faced death. But they continued. Why? Because they believed they had seen something worth dying for. They had seen the risen Jesus. Their message was simple. Death had been defeated. And perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden inside the question, why did Jesus go to hell? He did not go because he was a prisoner of darkness. He went into darkness so that darkness could be conquered. He entered the place humanity feared most, and he came out victorious. That changes the way Christians understand their own suffering. When life becomes dark, they can remember that Jesus has already walked through darkness. When they feel abandoned, they can remember that Jesus knows what suffering feels like. When they face death, they can remember that Jesus himself entered the grave. And when they feel that everything is over, they can remember the stone, because the stone was not the end. It was the beginning of a new story. Maybe that is why the resurrection remains so powerful after 2,000 years. It speaks to something every human being understands. Fear, loss, pain, death. But it also speaks about something every human being longs for. Hope. Hope that broken things can be restored. Hope that darkness can be overcome. Hope that death does not have the final word. And hope that God can bring life from places that appear completely dead. So, what did Jesus do in hell? According to Christian belief, he entered the realm of the dead after his crucifixion, but he did not remain there. He came out, he rose again, and through his resurrection, Christians believe he demonstrated that the power of death could not hold him. The story began in a garden. It moved to a cross. It descended into darkness, and then it returned to the light. The tomb was empty. The stone was gone, and Jesus was alive. That is why the Christian story does not end with Jesus died. It ends with Jesus is risen. And perhaps there is a reason you are hearing this story today. Maybe you are going through something you cannot understand. Maybe your life feels like a dark room with no door. Maybe you have prayed and heard nothing. Maybe you are standing in front of your own impossible stone. If so, remember this. The disciples once stood in front of a sealed tomb too. They thought their hope was dead. They thought the story was finished. But they were wrong, because behind that stone was not the end. There was a resurrection waiting to happen. So don't assume that silence means God has abandoned you. Don't assume that darkness means the light is gone. And don't assume that your story is finished simply because you cannot see what comes next. Sometimes the greatest chapter begins where you think the story has ended. Jesus entered the darkness. Jesus faced death. Jesus conquered the grave. And Jesus rose again. The darkness could not hold him. And that is the promise at the heart of the story. No matter how deep the darkness becomes, there is still hope beyond the tomb.